Winter storms have a way of trapping people. They bury roads, cut off power, and leave entire towns isolated for hours or even days. Most people worry about freezing temperatures, getting stranded, or losing control of their car on an icy highway. Those are the dangers everyone expects. But sometimes, the storm isn't the most dangerous thing waiting outside. Tonight, I am sharing 3 unforgettable true stories from people whose lives changed forever during brutal winter blizzards. In one story, a man is forced to seek shelter in a stranger's house after his own home becomes inaccessible, only to discover that escaping the storm may have been the safest part of his night. In another, someone knocks on a lonely house asking for help during a whiteout. It sounds like an ordinary emergency, until one tiny detail reveals that the stranger standing at the door may not be telling the truth. And in the final story, an experienced backcountry skier survives a devastating avalanche, only to receive help from someone who leaves behind a mystery that still has no explanation years later. Each of these people walked into a snowstorm expecting to fight against nature instead. They found themselves facing something far more terrifying. So, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let these chilling winter encounters remind you that sometimes the cold isn't what should scare you the most. About 5 years ago, I made a decision that completely changed my life. I packed up everything I owned and moved to South Dakota. It wasn't because I got some incredible job offer or because I was chasing a fresh start. Honestly, it was something I should have done years earlier. My parents had been telling me forever that it was time to move out and learn how to live on my own. Eventually, I stopped making excuses and finally took the leap. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if staying with my parents would have been the better choice. I've never been much of a people person. Crowded neighborhoods, noisy apartment buildings, and constant small talk with neighbors just weren't for me. I like quiet. I like privacy. I enjoy coming home after work and knowing that nobody's going to knock on my door or ask me to join a neighborhood barbecue. So when I found a small house sitting on a remote piece of land in one of the snowiest parts of South Dakota, it honestly felt perfect. The property was exactly what I was looking for. The nearest house wasn't next door. In fact, every home in the area sat hundreds of yards apart. If you stood on my front porch, you'd mostly see open fields, scattered trees, and long stretches of empty road. During the winter, those roads often disappeared beneath thick layers of snow, making the entire area feel even more isolated. Most people would have looked at that place and thought it was lonely. I looked at it and thought it was peaceful. For the first few years, life couldn't have gone much smoother. Every morning, I'd wake up before sunrise, grab a quick breakfast, and drive to work. After work, I'd head straight home, make dinner, watch a movie or play a few games, then go to bed and do it all over again the next day. Simple, predictable, exactly how I liked it. Because everyone lived so far apart, I never really got to know any of my neighbors. It wasn't personal. We simply had no reason to interact. Weeks could pass without me seeing another person anywhere near my house, and I was perfectly happy keeping it that way. The isolation became normal, comfortable, even. Which is probably why I never imagined that one ordinary winter afternoon would force me to depend on the very people I'd spent years avoiding. It happened in early February. I was halfway through my workday when I noticed snow beginning to fall outside the office windows. At first, nobody seemed concerned. South Dakota gets plenty of snow every winter, so seeing a few flakes drifting through the air wasn't exactly unusual. But within an hour, everything changed. The snowfall became heavier. The wind started roaring across the parking lot, pushing snow sideways instead of down. Visibility dropped so quickly that buildings across the street almost disappeared behind a wall of white. People around the office stopped talking about work and started checking weather alerts on their phones. The local forecasts all said the same thing. A major blizzard was moving in. Before long, my boss walked through the office with a serious expression I'd never seen before. "Pack it up," he said. "Everyone needs to head home. Now." Nobody argued. Within minutes, the parking lot was full of employees rushing to their vehicles, all hoping to beat the worst of the storm before the roads became impossible to drive. I wasn't too worried. I drove a lifted truck that had handled plenty of brutal winters before. Snow had never really been a problem for it. At least, that is what I believed as I climbed into the driver's seat and started the long drive home. The first part of the drive wasn't too bad. Snow was falling steadily, but nothing I hadn't dealt with before. I turned on the radio to hear the latest weather update while the windshield wipers worked overtime, sweeping away the thick flakes piling up on the glass. The announcer's voice was calm but urgent. "Authorities are advising everyone to stay off the roads unless travel is absolutely necessary. Visibility is expected to continue deteriorating throughout the afternoon." I glanced out at the highway. They weren't exaggerating. With every mile, the storm grew stronger. The wind slammed into the side of my truck, making the steering wheel feel heavier in my hands. Snow drifted across the pavement in long white waves. covering the tire tracks almost as quickly as they appeared. Several cars ahead of me slowed to a crawl. One SUV had already slid into a ditch, and a tow truck was struggling to reach it through the worsening conditions. Seeing that made me grip the steering wheel a little tighter. For the first time during the drive, I realized this wasn't just another winter storm. This was the kind of blizzard people talked about for years afterward. Even with my truck, there were moments when I questioned whether I'd make it home without getting stuck. Thankfully, after what felt like an eternity, I finally turned onto the familiar road leading toward my property. Relief washed over me. I was almost there. The snow had already piled several inches deep across my long driveway, but my truck pushed through without much trouble. By the time I parked in front of my house, I couldn't stop smiling. Made it. That single thought was all I cared about. I shut off the engine, grabbed my backpack, and hurried toward the front door, hoping to get inside before the weather became any worse. The freezing wind bit at my face as I pulled my keys from my pocket. I slid the key into the lock. Turned it. Nothing. I frowned and tried again. Still nothing. The key refused to move. At first, I assumed I just hadn't inserted it correctly. I pulled it out, wiped away the ice that had collected around the keyhole, and tried again. Nothing. The lock wouldn't budge. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. I leaned closer and realized the entire locking mechanism had frozen solid. Come on. I breathed warm air onto the lock, hoping to melt enough ice for the key to turn. Nothing. I cupped my gloved hands around it, trying to warm the metal. Nothing. I even smacked the doorknob a couple of times out of pure frustration. Still. Nothing. The door might as well have been welded shut. By now, the wind had become unbearable. Snow was blowing sideways across the porch, stinging every bit of exposed skin on my face. I knew I couldn't stand there much longer. Defeated, I walked back to my truck and climbed inside. The heater blasted warm air almost immediately, and I sat there staring at my own front door, trying to figure out what to do next. Maybe I could just wait. The storm had to calm down eventually, right? I checked my phone. The latest weather alert made my heart sink. The blizzard wasn't expected to let up for several more hours outside. The snowfall only seemed to get heavier. Within minutes, I noticed snow piling around my tires. Fast, far faster than I was comfortable with. A thought suddenly crossed my mind. What if I can't leave anymore? I shifted the truck into reverse and gently pressed the accelerator. The tires spun. Snow sprayed everywhere. The truck barely moved. I tried again with a little more power. Nothing. My stomach dropped. I was stuck. My house was locked. My truck couldn't get out. And the storm was only getting worse. That is when I realized I was completely out of options. For a few minutes, I just sat there in the driver's seat, watching the snow pile higher and higher around my truck. The heater was still running, filling the cab with warm air. But it wasn't enough to calm me down anymore. Every few seconds, I glanced from my frozen front door to the windshield, hoping the storm would somehow ease up. It didn't. If anything, it became even more violent. The wind shook the entire truck, and thick waves of snow swept across the driveway so fast that the tire tracks I'd made only minutes earlier had already disappeared. I checked my phone again. 1 bar of service, then none. Perfect even if I wanted to call someone. There wasn't anyone nearby who could realistically help. My parents lived hours away, and I hadn't bothered getting to know any of my neighbors since moving there. At the time, keeping to myself had always seemed like the perfect lifestyle. Now, it felt like one of the biggest mistakes I'd ever made. I looked at the fuel gauge. There was enough gas to keep the heater running for a while, but not all night. Eventually, the engine would have to shut off. Then I'd be trapped inside a freezing truck with temperatures dropping by the minute. That wasn't a plan. That was just delaying the inevitable. I took a deep breath and forced myself to think logically. There had to be another option. Then the obvious answer hit me. The neighbors. I hated the idea immediately. Showing up unannounced at a stranger's house during a blizzard wasn't exactly something I'd ever imagined doing. I didn't know their names. I didn't know if they were friendly. For all I knew, they might not even answer the door. But I also knew one thing. If I stayed where I was, I might not make it through the night. That decision suddenly became very easy. I pulled my coat tighter, zipped it all the way to my chin, grabbed my gloves, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me like a punch. The wind stole my breath before I could even take 2 steps. Snow blasted against my face so hard it felt like handfuls of tiny needles. I lowered my head and pushed forward, using my driveway as a guide while trying not to lose my footing. The closest house was only about 1/4 of a mile away. Normally, that would have been an easy walk. During a full-blown blizzard, it felt endless. Every few yards I had to stop and shield my eyes just to figure out where I was going. Visibility had become so poor that the neighboring house disappeared behind curtains of blowing snow. only becoming visible again whenever the wind briefly shifted. The silence was almost as unsettling as the storm itself. There were no passing cars, no voices, no sounds except the constant roar of the wind. It felt like the entire world had disappeared beneath the snow. By the time I reached the neighbor's property, I was shivering uncontrollably. My jeans were soaked from walking through the deep drifts. My boots felt like blocks of ice. Even my fingers, protected by thick gloves, had started going numb. I climbed the wooden steps onto the small front porch and finally got my first good look at the house. It wasn't what I'd expected. The place looked neglected. The paint was faded and peeling from the siding. Several porch boards sagged under my weight. One of the windows had been covered with plywood instead of glass. The whole house had an abandoned feeling, despite the faint light glowing through one of the front windows. I hesitated. Something about the place made me uneasy, but the storm behind me reminded me I didn't have the luxury of being picky. I raised my hand and knocked as hard as I could. The sound echoed through the small house. I waited. Nothing. I knocked again. Still nothing. Nearly a full minute passed. I was just about to give up and fight my way toward the next house when bang! The front door flew open so suddenly that I instinctively stumbled backward. Standing in the doorway was a man I'd never seen before. He looked to be around 50 years old with graying hair, tired eyes, and a face so ordinary that it would have been impossible to pick him out of a crowd. For several long seconds, he simply stared at me, without smiling, without speaking, without even blinking. Then, in a calm, almost emotionless voice, he finally said, "I am Joe." For what felt like several seconds, neither of us said a word. The wind howled behind me, blowing snow through the open doorway, while the man continued staring as if he were trying to decide whether I belonged there. Finally, I cleared my throat. "Sorry to bother you," I said. "My front door froze shut and my truck is stuck in the driveway. I was wondering if I could stay here until the storm dies down." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past me toward the blizzard, then back at my face. His expression never changed. Without saying another word, he stepped to one side of the doorway and motioned for me to come inside. "Thanks," I said, stepping into the house. The warmth hit me almost instantly. After battling freezing winds for the last 15 or 20 minutes, simply standing somewhere dry felt incredible. I closed the door behind me and brushed the snow from my jacket and boots while trying to catch my breath. "I am Joe," the man repeated quietly. "I am Mark," I replied, introducing myself. He gave a small nod. No handshake. No smile, just another long, uncomfortable silence. I figured he probably wasn't much of a talker. The living room was small and dimly lit by a single lamp sitting beside an old recliner. The furniture looked like it had been there for decades. The couch sagged in the middle, the wallpaper was beginning to peel away near the ceiling, and several stacks of newspapers sat piled against one wall as though nobody had touched them in years. The whole place smelled faintly of old wood and dust. It wasn't filthy, just forgotten. Joe pointed toward the couch. "You can sit. Thanks." I lowered myself onto the worn cushions, grateful to finally get off my feet. Joe settled into the recliner directly across from me. For a few moments, the room was completely silent. The only sound came from the wind rattling the windows outside, trying to be polite. I started making conversation. "So, have you lived out here long?" "A long time." His answer was short, almost automatic. "You always get storms like this around here. They happen. Only a few words." I forced a small smile. "I am still getting used to South Dakota winters." He didn't respond. Instead, his eyes drifted away from me. At first, I thought he was simply distracted. But then I noticed something strange. His gaze wasn't wandering randomly. It kept moving around the room. He'd look at me, then suddenly glance toward the hallway. A few seconds later, he'd look at the ceiling, then toward the far corner of the room, then back at me again. It was as though he couldn't keep his attention on one thing for more than a few seconds. I tried asking another question. "What do you do for work?" He opened his mouth to answer. "I used to." Then he stopped. Completely. His eyes fixed on the empty wall beside me. Not near me. Not above me. Directly at the blank wall. His face became completely expressionless. He just stared. I turned my head to see what had caught his attention. There was nothing there. Just faded wallpaper and an old picture frame hanging slightly crooked. When I looked back at Joe, he blinked a couple of times, almost like he'd forgotten I was sitting in front of him. "What were you saying?" I asked. You were talking about work." "Oh." He looked confused for a second before quietly saying, "I don't work anymore." That was it. No explanation, no follow-up. The conversation died again. A knot began forming in my stomach. Maybe he was just socially awkward. Maybe he wasn't used to visitors. I kept trying to convince myself there was a perfectly normal explanation for his behavior. But the longer I sat there, the more uncomfortable I became. Every few minutes, his attention drifted somewhere else. Sometimes toward the hallway, sometimes toward the ceiling, sometimes toward the ceiling, sometimes toward empty spaces that seemed to hold his complete focus. It almost felt like he wasn't alone in that room, or at least he didn't believe he was. By this point, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously off. It wasn't just that Joe was quiet. I am quiet too, so that alone wouldn't have bothered me. It was the way he seemed disconnected from reality. Every conversation felt interrupted by something only he could see. One second, he'd be answering my question, and the next he'd be staring into empty space as if someone had just walked into the room. The silence inside the house became heavier with every passing minute. Outside, the blizzard continued pounding against the walls. The wind whistled through tiny gaps around the windows, making the old house creak every so often. I glanced toward the front door. For just a second, I considered leaving, but the thought disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Going back outside meant walking into a whiteout with no guarantee I'd even find the next house. The temperature was dropping fast, and I was already exhausted from the hike over here. As strange as Joe seemed, the storm still felt like the bigger threat. At least, that is what I kept telling myself. Trying to end the awkward conversation, I stretched my arms and forced a yawn. Honestly, I said, it has been a really long day. Would it be okay if I got some sleep? Joe looked at me for a moment. Then, for the first time all evening, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't even a comforting one. It was small, almost relieved, like I just said exactly what he'd been hoping to hear. Of course, he replied quietly. You can sleep here, he pointed toward the couch. I thanked him and started making myself comfortable, using my folded jacket as a pillow. Before lying down, I looked over at him. Would you mind turning off the light? Without saying a word, he reached over and switched off the lamp. The room instantly became dark. Only the pale glow of moonlight reflecting off the snow outside seeped through the windows, casting faint gray shadows across the living room. I lay back on the couch and closed my eyes. Or at least, I pretended to. Something deep inside me refused to let my guard down. I slowed my breathing, hoping Joe would think I'd fallen asleep. Several seconds passed, then a full minute. Curiosity got the better of me. Carefully, without moving my head, I cracked one eye open just enough to see the doorway. Joe hadn't moved. He was still standing there, perfectly still, watching me. My pulse instantly quickened. He wasn't checking to see if I was comfortable. He wasn't saying good night. He was simply standing in the darkness, looking directly at me. I kept my breathing slow, pretending to be asleep while every muscle in my body tensed. The silence became unbearable. 5 seconds, 10, 20. It felt like an entire minute before he finally turned away. Without making a sound, he walked down the hallway. A door slowly creaked open, then click. It closed again. I waited another few minutes before allowing myself to relax even a little. What was that? I whispered to myself. I tried convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just making sure I had settled in. Maybe he had trouble sleeping. Maybe I was letting the stress of the blizzard affect my judgment. Eventually, exhaustion began winning the battle. My eyelids grew heavier. The warmth of the room slowly replaced the tension in my body, little by little. I started drifting towards sleep. Then, thump. My eyes flew open. The sound had come from somewhere above me. I held my breath. A few seconds later, scrape. It sounded like something heavy dragging slowly across wood. At first, I assumed it was snow shifting on the roof. That seemed reasonable. Old houses made strange noises during winter storms all the time. But then it happened again. Thump. Scrape. This time, it sounded unmistakably like footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. Moving directly above the living room. A cold shiver ran through my entire body, because I suddenly remembered something that made absolutely no sense. Joe's house only had one floor. I lay completely still. The sound came again. Thump. A few seconds later. Scrape. It wasn't random anymore. It had a rhythm. Slow. Deliberate. Almost as if someone was pacing back and forth directly above the living room. My eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling. Every logical explanation I could think of rushed through my head. Maybe the roof is settling. Maybe the heavy snow is shifting. Maybe there is an animal trapped somewhere. But the longer I listened, the harder those explanations became to believe. The footsteps were too steady, too measured. Whatever was making them seemed to be moving with purpose. I glanced toward the hallway where Joe had disappeared. Everything remained silent. No light, no movement. Just the endless roar of the blizzard outside. Then, thud. A loud impact shook the ceiling. Dust drifted down from one of the wooden beams. I instinctively sat upright. My heart slammed against my chest. The noise had sounded much heavier than the footsteps, almost like someone had jumped or dropped something large onto the floor above me. I stared upward, unable to move. Then, I felt it. Someone was watching me. Slowly, I turned my head toward the hallway. Joe was standing there. I froze. He hadn't made a sound. I never heard the bedroom door open. I never heard footsteps crossing the floor. One moment the hallway had been empty. The next, he was simply standing there in the darkness. His face was impossible to read. His eyes were locked directly onto mine. Neither of us spoke. The room felt unnaturally quiet. Even the wind outside seemed distant. Finally, I forced out a shaky breath. "Joe," my voice barely rose above a whisper. "Did you hear that?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring at me. Then, without warning, he charged. He let out a loud, guttural scream and sprinted across the room faster than I thought possible. Before I could even stand, he launched himself over the back of the couch. The impact sent both of us crashing onto the floor. Pain shot through my shoulder as my body slammed into the hardwood beneath the thin carpet. Before I could recover, Joe climbed on top of me, his hands wrapped around my throat. He squeezed with terrifying strength. I grabbed his wrists, trying to pry them away, but it was useless. For a man who looked average only minutes earlier, he was unbelievably strong. My lungs burned. My vision began narrowing. Panic exploded inside me. I kicked and twisted beneath him, desperate to break free. Joe's face was only inches from mine now. His calm expression was gone. His eyes were wide with panic, not anger, not hatred. Panic, as though he believed he had to stop me before something terrible happened. "Stop fighting," he shouted. "You don't understand." His grip tightened. "She needs someone." I struggled harder. His words came out faster now, almost impossible to follow. "She's been alone, so lonely, she'll love you. You'll stay with her." The words sent a chill through my entire body. He wasn't threatening me for money. He wasn't trying to rob me. He genuinely believed he was giving me to someone. Someone he kept calling her. And judging by the fear in his voice, he truly believed she was already inside the house. At that moment, I stopped trying to understand what Joe was talking about. I was focused on one thing: staying alive. His hands were still crushing my throat, and every second that passed made it harder to breathe. Black spots began creeping into the edges of my vision as I clawed at his wrists with everything I had. He barely reacted. Instead, he kept muttering the same disturbing phrases over and over. "She doesn't like being alone. She needs someone. You'll make her happy." His voice sounded desperate, not like a man trying to murder someone, but like someone who genuinely believed he was carrying out an important responsibility. That realization terrified me even more. Adrenaline surged through my body. With every ounce of strength I had left, I drove my knee upward into Joe's side. He grunted. His grip loosened, just enough. I twisted my shoulders, shoved him as hard as I could, and finally managed to throw him off balance. We both rolled across the floor. An old end table tipped over, crashing into the wall. A ceramic lamp shattered beside us. The sudden noise echoed through the house. I didn't wait to see if Joe was getting back up. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted toward the front door. Behind me, I heard Joe yelling, "Don't!" His footsteps thundered across the old wooden floor. I grabbed the doorknob with shaking hands. For one horrifying second, I thought this door might be frozen too. Thankfully, it turned. I yanked the door open. A blast of freezing air exploded into the house, carrying snowflakes that swirled through the living room. Without thinking twice, I ran straight into the blizzard. The wind hit me like a truck. Snow instantly blinded me. I could barely tell where the yard ended and the road began. Still, I kept running. Behind me, Joe reached the doorway. I expected him to chase me instead. He stopped. I glanced back just once. He was standing on the porch, staring into the storm. His face no longer looked angry. It looked frightened. Then he shouted something that I will never forget. His voice barely carried over the screaming wind. "She is not going to be happy." A chill shot through my entire body. Before I could process those words, he yelled again, "You weren't supposed to leave." His voice cracked with panic. Almost like he wasn't worried about losing me. He was worried about what would happen because I'd escaped. I didn't stop running. I couldn't. The snow was now nearly knee-deep in places, making every step feel like I was dragging heavy weights behind me. The freezing air burned my lungs. My throat ached where Joe had tried to choke me. Several times I slipped, catching myself just before falling face first into the snow. Every time I stumbled, one terrifying thought raced through my mind. What if he comes after me? I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, to feel a hand grab my shoulder, to hear Joe calling my name. But all I could hear was the relentless howl of the blizzard. Finally, through the blowing snow, I spotted another porch light glowing in the distance. It was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. I gathered every bit of strength I had left and stumbled toward it, praying that someone was home. Because after what had just happened, there was no chance I was ever going back to Joe's house. I don't remember much about the run to the next house. Everything after leaving Joe's porch felt like one long blur of wind, snow, and pure adrenaline. The blizzard was so intense that I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. Every step sank deep into fresh snow, and more than once I nearly lost my footing. My lungs burned. My throat throbbed where Joe's hands had been. Every breath felt sharp enough to cut. Still, I refused to stop. Fear pushed me forward long after my body wanted to give up. Finally, through the swirling snow, I reached the porch of another house. Without hesitating, I started pounding on the front door with both fists. "Help!" I yelled. "Please, somebody help!" For a few agonizing seconds. Nothing happened. Then the porch light came on. The door slowly opened, revealing a middle-aged couple staring at me with shocked expressions. I must have looked like I'd escaped a nightmare. My clothes were soaked with snow. My face was pale. Fresh red marks circled my neck. I was gasping for air so hard I could barely speak. The man immediately stepped aside. "Get inside." I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled into the house, and he quickly locked the door behind me. His wife hurried over with a thick blanket while he guided me toward a chair beside the fireplace. "Take it easy," he said. "You are safe now." Safe. It was the first time all night that I actually believed those words. For several minutes I couldn't speak. I just sat there shaking, trying to catch my breath while the warmth slowly returned to my hands. Eventually they asked what had happened, so I told them everything. I explained how my front door had frozen shut, how my truck became trapped in the snow, how I'd walked to the nearest house looking for shelter, how I'd met a man named Joe. I described his strange behavior, the way he constantly stared into empty spaces, the unexplained footsteps above the ceiling of a one-story house, and finally, the attack. Neither of them interrupted me. Neither of them questioned whether I was telling the truth. Instead, they exchanged a long, uneasy glance. The husband slowly leaned back in his chair. "You said his name was Joe." I nodded. His face grew noticeably more serious. "I was afraid you were going to say that." A cold feeling settled over me. "You know him?" He sighed. "Everybody around here knows Joe." The room became silent again. After a long pause, he quietly continued. "About 10 years ago, his wife disappeared." I frowned. "What do you mean, disappeared?" "No one ever found her. There was never enough evidence to charge anyone. But around here," he looked directly at me, "most people believe Joe killed her." I felt my stomach drop. Every strange thing I'd witnessed suddenly came rushing back. Joe staring at empty corners of the room, his whispered conversations with someone who wasn't there, the footsteps coming from above the ceiling, his desperate insistence that she needed company. And finally, the words he'd screamed as I escaped. "She is not going to be happy." For the rest of the morning, I couldn't stop thinking about that sentence. Who was she? Was Joe talking about his missing wife? Had years of guilt driven him completely insane? Or was there something inside that old house that couldn't be explained to this day? I honestly don't know. Later that afternoon, after the roads were cleared, I finally made it back to my own house. A locksmith eventually managed to unfreeze my front door, and I reported everything that had happened to the police. I told them about the attack. I told them about Joe. As far as I know, nothing ever came of it. Whether there wasn't enough evidence or they simply couldn't prove what had happened, I never heard about Joe being arrested. Life eventually returned to normal, but I never forgot that night. Even now, years later, I still live in the same house. Every time winter arrives, every time another blizzard rolls across South Dakota, I remember walking through that storm, believing the freezing weather was the greatest danger I faced. I was wrong. Sometimes, the safest place isn't the nearest house, and sometimes the storm outside isn't nearly as frightening as the person waiting behind the front door. Imagine you are home alone during one of the worst blizzards of the year. The roads have been shut down, the wind is screaming outside, and weather officials are telling everyone to stay indoors until morning. You lock every door, make yourself a cup of coffee, and settle in, believing you are finally safe. Then, someone knocks. At first, it sounds like exactly what you'd expect during a storm, a stranded traveler desperately looking for shelter. Any decent person would want to help. but as you look closer, something doesn't add up. The man standing outside claims he has been walking through the blizzard for miles. Yet somehow, his boots are completely clean. No snow. No slush. No wet footprints. Nothing. That tiny detail is enough to make you question everything. Who is he? Where did he really come from? And why does he keep returning to your windows? Even after you've refused to let him inside. What happened that night left me questioning whether I narrowly escaped a dangerous criminal or something far more difficult to explain. I was 27 years old when this happened. At the time, I was living alone in a small house in upstate New York. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was perfect for me. I worked remotely in finance, so most of my days were spent sitting in a home office, staring at spreadsheets and joining video meetings. Living alone never bothered me. In fact, I preferred it. The quiet helped me focus, and after work, I enjoyed having the entire house to myself. My neighborhood was peaceful. The nearest houses were spread far enough apart to give everyone their privacy, and nothing unusual had ever happened there. Until one winter night, the weather forecast had been warning about a major blizzard for nearly 2 days. Every local news station was telling people to stay home, avoid unnecessary travel, and prepare for power outages. I took the warning seriously. Earlier that afternoon, I stopped by the grocery store and picked up enough food and bottled water to last several days. I made sure my phone, laptop, and backup battery packs were fully charged, checked that my flashlights had fresh batteries, and even brought extra blankets into the living room just in case the power went out overnight. By early evening, the snow had started falling. At first, it looked peaceful. Large flakes drifted slowly past the windows while the wind remained calm. It almost looked beautiful. But that didn't last long. Within a couple of hours, the storm intensified dramatically. The wind began rattling the windows so hard that I could actually hear the glass vibrating. Snow swirled through the air in thick white waves, completely hiding the street outside. By 8 o'clock, I couldn't even see my mailbox anymore. The entire world beyond my front yard had disappeared behind a wall of blowing snow. I turned on the local news while making myself a cup of coffee. The meteorologist didn't sound optimistic. "This storm is expected to continue throughout the night," he said. "Travel conditions are now considered extremely dangerous. If you are already home, stay there. Emergency crews may not be able to reach stranded motorists until morning." That was all I needed to hear. I walked through the house one last time, making sure every door and window was locked. Then I settled onto the couch with my coffee, planning to watch a movie until the storm passed. Outside, the wind screamed louder with every passing minute. The branches of the trees bent violently, throwing strange shadows across the snow whenever the porch light caught them. It was the kind of night where you were simply grateful to be indoors. Around 9:30, my phone buzzed with another emergency weather alert. Blizzard warning. Avoid all travel. Remain indoors. I set the phone on the coffee table and leaned back, feeling thankful. I'd listened to the forecast earlier that day. If anyone was still outside in weather like this, they were either incredibly unlucky or making a very dangerous decision. I had no idea that only a few minutes later, someone would knock on my front door. The knock wasn't loud, just 3 slow, deliberate taps. Knock, knock. At first, I assumed I'd imagined it. The wind had been making all kinds of strange noises against the house, and old homes tend to creak during storms. I muted the television and sat perfectly still, listening. For several seconds, nothing. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time there was no doubt. Someone was standing outside my front door. I frowned. That didn't make any sense. The weather was so bad that emergency officials were telling people not to leave their homes under any circumstances. There weren't any businesses within walking distance, and none of my friends or family would ever drive across town in conditions like this. So who could possibly be outside? I quietly stood up and walked toward the front window. Keeping the lights inside the house off in the entryway, I carefully pulled one corner of the curtain aside. A man was standing on my front porch. He looked to be somewhere in his 40s, wearing a dark winter coat with the hood pulled over his head. Snow whipped around him in violent gusts, making it difficult to see his face clearly. He wasn't pounding on the door. He wasn't yelling for help, he was simply standing there waiting. Another slow knock echoed through the house. Knock, knock, knock. I hesitated for a moment before walking closer to the door. "Can I help you?" I called through the wood. The man looked up. His voice sounded calm, almost too calm. "My car went off the road," he said. "My phone's dead, and I've been walking for a while. Could I come inside for a few minutes?" It sounded like a perfectly reasonable request. Under normal circumstances, I probably would have opened the door without thinking twice. But something about the situation felt wrong. I looked through the narrow glass panel beside the door, trying to get a better look at him. That is when I noticed it. His boots. They were almost perfectly clean. I blinked. thinking maybe the poor lighting was playing tricks on me. I looked again, still clean. There was no packed snow around the soles, no slush, no wet footprints leading across my porch. Nothing, if he'd really been walking through a blizzard for miles. His boots should have been completely covered. Instead, they looked as though he'd just stepped out of a warm, dry vehicle. A knot formed in my stomach. "Where's your car?" I asked. He pointed vaguely toward the road. "Back there somewhere." "How far?" He paused. "I don't know." That answer immediately bothered me. If your car had just slid off the road, wouldn't you know roughly where you left it? I tried another question. "Do you need me to call 911? For the first time, his expression changed. Just for a split second, something flashed across his face. Not relief, not gratitude, disappointment. Then he quickly shook his head. "Number, I just need to warm up. I'll be fine after a few minutes." My grip tightened on the doorknob. Every instinct told me not to unlock it. The weather outside made me feel guilty. What if he really was stranded? What if I was about to leave an innocent man out in a deadly storm? But then I looked down one more time. His boots were still spotless, and there were still no footprints. I kept my hand on the doorknob, but I didn't unlock it. Something deep inside me kept telling me that if I opened that door, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. "I am sorry," I said through the door. "I am not comfortable letting anyone inside." The man didn't respond immediately. For several long seconds, he simply stood there, staring at the house through the narrow window beside the door. Then, in the same calm voice, he asked, "Are you sure?" There wasn't any anger in his tone. No frustration. If anything, he sounded strangely patient, almost as if he already knew he had all the time in the world. I swallowed hard. "If you are really stranded," I replied, "I'll call the police or emergency services for you. They'll come help." Another pause. Then he slowly shook his head. "Number, I don't need the police. I just need you to open the door." That answer sent a chill through my body. Most people trapped in a blizzard would be relieved if someone offered to call for help. This man wanted exactly one thing: to get inside my house, nothing else. "I am sorry," I repeated more firmly. "I am not opening the door." For the first time since he'd arrived, his expression changed. The polite smile faded. His face became completely blank. Without saying another word, he turned around and stepped off the porch. I stood there listening. Crunch, crunch, crunch. His boots moved slowly across the wooden steps. Then, silence. I waited another 30 seconds before looking through the front window. He was gone, at least. That is what I thought. I checked the driveway. Nothing. The road beyond it had disappeared beneath blowing snow. No figure, no flashlight, no movement anywhere. I let out a long breath. Maybe he'd gone to another house. Maybe someone else had decided to help him. Trying to convince myself everything was over, I walked back into the living room, but I couldn't relax. Something about that conversation kept bothering me. It wasn't just his spotless boots. It was the way he'd answered my questions. He never gave any real details. He didn't know where his car was. He didn't want emergency services. He only wanted one thing: for me to unlock the front door. I picked up my phone. The signal was weak because of the storm, but I still had enough service to dial 911 if I needed to. Just having the phone in my hand made me feel a little better. I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on the television. 5 minutes passed. Maybe 10. Then I heard another sound. Not at the front door. This time, it came from the side of the house. A soft tap. I turned my head toward the living room window. Another tap, then another tap, tap, tap. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Someone was tapping on my window. Every instinct in my body told me not to look. But curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I stood up from the couch and turned toward the living room window. The curtains were already closed, leaving only the faint outline of the glass visible against the darkness outside. Then, tap. The sound came again, slow, gentle, deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a tree branch. It sounded exactly like someone tapping the glass with a fingertip. I swallowed hard and reached for the edge of the curtain. For a second, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to ignore it completely, but another part needed to know whether the man was still outside. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the curtain back just enough to look through. He was there, standing only a few feet from the window. He wasn't pounding on the glass. He wasn't waving for help. He was simply staring directly into my living room. The porch light didn't reach that side of the house, making his face little more than a dark silhouette. But I could still make out his eyes. They were fixed on me. The moment our eyes met, he smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a grateful smile. It was slow, cold, almost satisfied. A chill ran down my spine. I immediately let the curtain fall shut. My heart was racing so hard I could hear it in my ears. Okay, I whispered to myself. This isn't normal. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. After what felt like forever, the dispatcher answered. 911. What is your emergency? I kept my voice as calm as I could. There is a man outside my house. He has been asking me to let him in. I refused, but now he is walking around my house and looking through my windows. The dispatcher asked for my address and told me officers would respond as soon as they safely could. Then she said something I didn't expect. Stay inside. Keep every door and window locked, and whatever happens, do not let him in. Those words erased any remaining doubt I had. I wasn't overreacting. Something was seriously wrong. I thanked her, ended the call, and immediately checked every lock in the house again. The front door was locked. The back door was locked. Every window was secured. Only after checking everything twice did I return to the living room. The tapping had stopped. The silence that followed was somehow even worse. I stood perfectly still, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. No tapping. Just the relentless howl of the blizzard outside. Maybe he'd finally left. I wanted to believe that. Then a loud metallic rattle echoed through the house. Clank. It came from the back door. Someone was trying the handle. My entire body froze. Another sharp rattle. Clank. This time it lasted longer. Whoever was outside wasn't knocking anymore. They were testing the lock, trying to see if the door would open. I slowly backed away from the kitchen, keeping my eyes fixed on the hallway leading toward the rear of the house. Then, the rattling stopped. For several seconds, everything was silent again, and somehow, that silence felt even more terrifying, because I had no idea where he had gone next. I didn't move. I stood in the middle of the living room, gripping my phone so tightly that my hands started to ache. The back door handle rattled once more. Clank, clank. Then, silence. 5 seconds, 10, nothing. I slowly backed away from the kitchen and positioned myself where I could see both the hallway and the front door at the same time. My pulse was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The police are on their way, I kept telling myself. Just hold on. Then I heard it, a faint crunch outside. Not at the back of the house anymore. This time, it was moving along the sidewall, slowly, as if someone were walking beneath the windows. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped directly beneath the living room window. For several long seconds, there wasn't a sound. Then, tap. One gentle tap against the glass. Another tap. Tap. I refused to look. After seeing that smile only minutes earlier, I had no desire to find out whether he was still standing there. The dispatcher had been very clear. Stay inside. Do not let him in. So I stayed exactly where I was. Another minute passed. The tapping stopped again. I listened carefully, expecting to hear footsteps moving away. Instead, I heard something much worse, a faint scraping sound, almost like someone slowly dragging their hand along the outside wall of the house. It started near the living room window, then continued toward the back. Scrape, scrape. The sound made every hair on my arm stand up. Whoever was outside wasn't trying to leave. He was circling the house, checking every window, every door, looking for a way inside. I quietly walked into the hallway and peeked toward the back door. Nothing. The curtains over the kitchen window were still closed. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Then my phone buzzed. It was the dispatcher. The officers are almost there, she said. Can you still see the individual? I carefully looked toward the front window without exposing myself. I don't see him anymore. Stay where you are, she replied. They should arrive within the next couple of minutes. I thanked her and ended the call. Those next 2 minutes felt longer than the entire night. Every little noise made me jump. The furnace turning on. The wind rattling the gutters. Ice hitting the windows. I questioned every sound. Then, in the distance, I heard it. Sirens very faint at first, but getting closer. Relief flooded through me. The man outside had to know they were coming too. Surely he'd leave now. I waited another few seconds before carefully peeking through the front curtain. The porch was empty. The driveway was empty. The road beyond my house was still buried beneath blowing snow. There was no sign of him anywhere. A minute later, flashing red and blue lights reflected across the snow as 2 police UFVs slowly pulled into my driveway. I rushed to open the front door only after the officers reached the porch. They stepped inside, brushing snow from their uniforms. You the one who called? One of them asked. I nodded. He has been trying to get into my house. The officers immediately searched the property. One checked around the backyard. The other walked the perimeter with a flashlight, scanning every corner of the house despite the blizzard. About 10 minutes later, they both came back. One of them looked genuinely puzzled. We didn't find anyone. I wasn't surprised. Whoever had been outside was gone. But then the second officer said something that made my stomach drop. We couldn't find any footprints either. I stared at him. What? He nodded slowly. There are your footprints from bringing in groceries earlier. Ours from walking around the house. But besides that, he looked toward the snow-covered yard. There aren't any tracks leading to your porch. There aren't any around your windows. And there aren't any near the back door. He paused. The snow is untouched. I felt every bit of color drain from my face, because I knew exactly what that meant. If there were no footprints, then how had someone knocked on my front door for a few seconds? I couldn't say anything. I simply stared at the officer, convinced I'd misunderstood him. No footprints, I repeated. He slowly shook his head. No, sir. We searched the entire property. He pointed toward the front yard. With the amount of fresh snow we've gotten tonight, anyone walking up to your house would have left a clear trail. I looked past him through the open doorway. The snow outside was untouched except for a few obvious sets of tracks. Mine from bringing groceries inside before the storm, and the officers from searching around the property. Nothing else. No trail leading to the porch, no footprints beneath the living room window, no tracks behind the house where I'd heard someone rattling the back door. Nothing. It didn't make any sense. I knew what I'd seen. I knew someone had been standing outside my window. I'd spoken to him. I'd watched him smile at me. I heard him walking around my house. I heard him testing the locks. That couldn't all have been my imagination. One of the officers noticed the confusion on my face. Storms can do strange things, he said. The wind carries sound in unusual ways. Sometimes people think someone's outside when it is really just branches or loose siding. I almost laughed. If all I'd heard were noises, maybe I could have believed that. But I'd looked directly into the man's face. I'd spoken to him through my front door. There was no explaining that away. The officers finished checking the property one last time before assuring me they'd increase patrols in the area overnight. If anything else happens, one of them said, call us immediately. I will. They climbed back into their SUVs, and within minutes the flashing lights disappeared into the blizzard. Suddenly, I was alone again. I locked the front door. Then I locked it again just to make sure. I checked every window, every room, every closet. Even though the police had already searched the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. Needless to say, I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room until sunrise with every light in the house turned on, jumping at every creak, every gust of wind, and every sound the storm made. When morning finally came, the blizzard had ended. Sunlight reflected off several feet of fresh snow, making everything outside look calm and peaceful. It was hard to believe the same yard had terrified me only hours earlier. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. I stepped outside to look for myself. The officers had been right. The snow around my house was almost perfectly smooth. My footprints from the previous afternoon had nearly disappeared beneath the fresh snowfall. The officers' tracks were still visible, but there was nothing else. No mystery trail. No footprints leading to my porch. No evidence that anyone had ever walked around my home. It was as though the man had never been there at all. I tried convincing myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the storm had erased the tracks before the police arrived. Maybe I'd overlooked something. Maybe there was a detail I simply couldn't remember correctly. But no matter how many explanations I came up with, none of them answered the biggest question. If no one had been outside, who knocked on my door? That experience changed me. Before that night, I never thought twice about opening the door for someone asking for help. Now, I always check my security cameras first. I never unlock the door without knowing exactly who is standing outside. And whenever a major snowstorm rolls through upstate New York, I remember that calm voice asking to come inside. I remember those perfectly clean boots. And most of all, I remember looking into fresh snow the next morning and realizing there wasn't a single footprint proving that the visitor had ever existed. Whether I encountered a dangerous person or something far stranger, I'll probably never know. Imagine you are skiing through a remote mountain range after a fresh snowfall. There isn't another person in sight. No ski lifts, no nearby cabins, no cell service. Just endless wilderness covered in untouched snow. For people who love backcountry skiing, that is paradise. Until one wrong turn, one unstable slope, one deafening roar. And suddenly, the entire mountain starts collapsing beneath your feet. Somehow, you survive. buried, injured, and miles away from help. You think your luck has finally changed when another skier appears out of nowhere. He knows exactly where to find you. He leads you safely down the mountain, and then, without saying goodbye, he simply disappears. Days later, you learn something that makes the entire experience impossible to explain. The man who saved your life may not have been alive to save anyone. I was 34 years old when this happened. I've been skiing for most of my life, and for several years I even competed professionally. While I was never good enough to make a career out of it, I gained enough experience to feel comfortable on terrain that most people would never even consider attempting. Eventually, I retired from competition, but I never lost my love for the mountains. If anything, it grew stronger. Whenever winter arrived, I'd spend as much time as possible exploring the backcountry of British Columbia. There was something incredibly peaceful about leaving the crowded ski resorts behind and venturing into untouched wilderness where the only sounds were the wind, the snow beneath your skis, and the occasional call of a distant raven. It wasn't for everyone. Backcountry skiing came with risks that resort skiers rarely had to think about. There were no ski patrols, no marked trails, no chairlifts, and if something went wrong, you were completely on your own. That is why preparation was everything. I never entered the backcountry without checking avalanche forecasts, weather conditions, and route reports. My backpack always contained emergency supplies, extra food, water, a first aid kit, and avalanche safety equipment. Experience teaches you one important lesson. The mountain doesn't care how skilled you are. One bad decision can end your life. The day everything happened started almost perfectly. The forecast predicted clear skies with fresh powder from a recent snowfall. Avalanche conditions were listed as moderate in the area I planned to ski. Not ideal, but manageable if I stayed on conservative terrain and avoided steep slopes. I'd made similar trips dozens of times before. Nothing about that morning felt unusual. I arrived just after sunrise. The air was crisp, the sky was a brilliant blue, and the mountains stretched endlessly into the distance beneath a blanket of untouched snow. It was one of those rare mornings that reminded me exactly why I loved being out there. Before setting off, I double-checked every piece of gear. Beacon, probe, shovel, radio. Everything was working perfectly. I tightened my backpack straps, clipped into my skis, and started climbing toward the ridge I'd planned to descend. The hike took nearly 2 hours. It was exhausting, but reaching the top made every step worthwhile. The view was breathtaking. Snow-covered peaks stretched across the horizon in every direction, untouched by roads or buildings. It felt like standing at the edge of another world. For a few minutes, I simply stood there taking it all in. Then I pushed off. The first part of the descent was incredible. Fresh powder sprayed around my skis with every turn. The snow was light, smooth, and almost effortless to ride through. Every movement felt natural after so many years on the mountain. I couldn't stop smiling. This was exactly why I kept coming back. About halfway down the slope, I noticed something. The snow beneath my skis felt different. Softer, less stable. I slowed immediately. Years of experience had taught me never to ignore changes in the snowpack. I stopped and looked uphill. Everything appeared normal. No cracks, no movement, no warning signs. Still, that uneasy feeling refused to go away. I decided it wasn't worth the risk. Turning around wasn't an option, but I could adjust my route and move on to gentler terrain. I had just begun traversing across the slope when a sharp crack echoed through the mountain. The sound was so loud it felt like a gunshot. My heart instantly dropped, because I knew exactly what I'd just heard. The snow beneath me had fractured. The instant I heard that crack, every instinct I had screamed the same word: avalanche. I didn't stop to think. I shoved my ski poles into the snow and tried to angle toward a safer section of the slope, hoping I could escape before the entire mountainside gave way. For one terrifying second, nothing happened. Then the ground beneath my skis lurched. A deep, thunderous roar exploded across the mountain. It wasn't just loud, it was overwhelming. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the surrounding peaks until it drowned out every other noise. I glanced uphill. My heart nearly stopped. A massive section of snow had broken loose. The entire mountainside was moving. Thousands of tons of snow were racing downhill directly toward me. I pushed as hard as I could, trying to ski sideways out of its path. Every turn became harder than the last as the snow beneath my skis started collapsing. I knew the statistics. Once an avalanche caught you, your chances dropped dramatically. For a brief moment, I actually thought I might make it. Then the wall of snow hit me. It felt like being struck by a speeding truck. 1 second, I was skiing. The next, I was tumbling violently through complete chaos. The world disappeared into white. I had no sense of direction. Up, down, left. Right? Everything spun together as the avalanche carried me like a rag doll. My skis tore free from my boots. One of my poles vanished instantly. Something slammed into my shoulder. Then another impact hit my back. I instinctively threw my hands toward my face, trying to create a small pocket of air the way avalanche safety courses had taught me years earlier. I had no idea whether it would help. But training takes over when panic leaves no time to think. The roar continued for what felt like forever. Then, everything stopped. Complete silence. I tried to move. Nothing. My entire body was trapped beneath packed snow. The pressure was unbelievable. It felt as though several concrete slabs had been placed on top of me. I couldn't move my legs. I couldn't move my arms. Even breathing became difficult. For a terrifying moment, panic threatened to overwhelm me. Stay calm. I forced myself to remember every survival lesson I'd ever learned. Panicking would only waste oxygen. Slow breaths. Small movements. Think. I tested my fingers. My right hand moved slightly. My left arm was pinned completely. Good. At least I wasn't entirely immobilized. Using tiny movements, I felt around my face. To my immense relief, the small air pocket I'd tried to create was still there. Not large, but enough to breathe. I had survived the avalanche. At least for now. The next problem was even worse. I had absolutely no idea where I was. Completely buried beneath the snow, I couldn't tell which direction was up. Light barely filtered through the packed ice surrounding me. Everything looked the same, cold, white, silent. I knew time was against me. People buried in avalanches don't have hours to spare. If nobody found me soon, there was a very real chance I wouldn't survive. I tried shouting, "Help!" My voice sounded weak and muffled. The snow absorbed almost every sound. I yelled again, nothing, no answer, no distant voices, no helicopters, no other skiers, just silence. For the first time in my life, I truly believed I might die on that mountain. Then, very faintly, I heard something. A voice someone was calling out. It was distant but unmistakably human. My heart leaped with hope. I shouted as loudly as I could. "I am here." A few seconds passed. Then I heard the voice again. This time, it was closer. The voice came again. This time, it was much closer. "Hello. Can you hear me?" Relief washed over me so suddenly that I almost started laughing. "I am here," I shouted, forcing as much air into my lungs as I could. "I am buried." For a few seconds, there was no reply. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of someone moving through the snow. The crunch of skis, footsteps, and then a dull thump directly above me. Whoever it was had found my location. I wanted to yell again, but before I could, the sound of digging began. Snow scraped away in quick, practiced motions. It wasn't random. Whoever was digging knew exactly what they were doing. Within less than a minute, daylight broke through the packed snow above my face. Cold mountain air rushed into the tiny pocket where I'd been trapped. I gasped, filling my lungs with the deepest breath I'd ever taken. A gloved hand reached down. "Easy," the man said calmly. "I've got you." I grabbed his arm. Working together, he pulled me free from the avalanche debris. The moment I was out, I collapsed onto my hands and knees, coughing and trying to catch my breath. My entire body ached. My left shoulder burned with pain, and my right knee throbbed every time I tried to move it. The stranger crouched beside me. "You hurt?" I nodded. "I think my shoulder's messed up." He looked me over for a moment before helping me sit upright. Only then did I get a proper look at him. He appeared to be somewhere in his 40s. He wore older ski gear, nothing bright or modern, just a faded blue jacket, black snow pants, and mirrored ski goggles that hid his eyes. His equipment looked well used but carefully maintained. There was nothing particularly unusual about him. If I'd passed him at a ski resort, I probably wouldn't have remembered his face. "You were lucky," he said. "A few more feet deeper." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I already knew what he meant. I looked uphill at the enormous scar the avalanche had carved across the mountain. Seeing it from below made my stomach turn. The amount of snow that had come down was unbelievable. "I owe you my life," I said. He gave a small shrug, and Yon would have done the same. Something about that answer struck me as odd. There wasn't another person anywhere on the mountain. No other tracks, no distant voices, nothing. Just him. "Are you out here alone?" I asked. He nodded once. "So am I." I frowned. That surprised me. Most experienced backcountry skiers avoid traveling alone because of exactly what had just happened to me. Before I could ask another question, he stood and looked toward the valley below. "You shouldn't stay here. The slope could slide again." He was right. Even after surviving one avalanche, secondary slides remained a real danger. He picked up one of my skis, which had been partially buried nearby, and handed it to me. "The other one's gone," he said. We'll have to walk. I struggled to my feet. Pain shot through my shoulder immediately. The stranger noticed. Without saying anything, he moved beside me and took part of my weight. Lean on me. I did. Together, we began making our way down the mountain. As we walked, I tried making conversation. What is your name? For a moment, he didn't answer. Finally, without looking at me, he quietly said, names don't matter. The response caught me off guard. I gave a small, awkward laugh. I'd still like to know who saved my life. He remained silent. The only sounds were the wind sweeping across the mountains and our boots crunching through fresh snow. After several minutes, I realized something else. Despite helping support my weight over uneven terrain, the man never seemed out of breath, never stumbled, never complained. He moved through the mountains with an effortless confidence that made it seem as though he knew every inch of the landscape. Almost as if he'd walked this exact route countless times before. The hike down the mountain was slow. Much slower than it should have been. Every step sent a sharp pain through my shoulder and my right knee felt weaker with each passing minute. If I had been alone, I honestly don't think I would have made it very far before collapsing. The stranger never complained. Whenever the terrain became steep, he adjusted his pace to match mine. When I slipped, he caught my arm before I could fall. He always seemed to know the safest route, avoiding unstable slopes without ever stopping to think. It was as if he'd memorized the mountain. After nearly half an hour of walking, I finally asked the question that had been bothering me. How did you find me? He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. I heard it. The avalanche, he nodded. I knew someone would be caught. His answer sounded simple enough, but something didn't sit right. Avalanches can be heard from miles away, but locating one buried person in a massive debris field isn't easy. Even trained rescue teams often rely on avalanche transceivers to pinpoint victims. Yet somehow, he had walked almost directly to me. No searching, no hesitation, almost as though he'd known exactly where I was buried. I looked around. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction. Fresh snow covered everything. Then I noticed something strange. There weren't many ski tracks. In fact, there was only one clear set. Mine. I frowned and looked behind us again. The stranger was walking only a few feet away. So where were his tracks? For a moment, I convinced myself they were simply blending into the uneven snow. That had to be it. There was no other explanation. Eventually, the trees began thinning, and I recognized part of the route leading back toward the parking area. Relief flooded through me. We're almost there, I said. The stranger gave a small nod. You'll be fine now. Those words caught my attention. I turned toward him. What do you mean? Instead of answering, he stopped walking. I took another few steps before realizing he wasn't beside me anymore. I turned around. He was standing about 20 feet behind me, motionless among the snow-covered trees. I can make it from here, he said calmly. I looked ahead. The parking area was finally visible through the trees. Several vehicles were parked there, and in the distance I could see 2 members of the local search and rescue team preparing equipment. I smiled with relief. They'll want to thank you too. He didn't respond. Come on, I said. Let's go. For the first time since we'd met, he smiled. It was warm, peaceful, almost reassuring. Then he quietly said, my job is done. Before I could reply, one of the rescuers spotted me. Hey, his shout echoed through the trees. We've got him. 2 rescue workers immediately started running toward us. I turned to wave them over. It was him. I shouted, pointing back toward the stranger. He found me. The rescuers reached me within seconds. One supported my injured shoulder while the other began checking me for signs of hypothermia. You are lucky to be alive, one of them said. I nodded and pointed back toward the trees. He saved me. Both rescuers looked in the direction I was pointing. Then they looked back at me. There isn't anyone there. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. I turned around. The stranger was gone. There was no one standing among the trees. No blue jacket, no black snow pants, no mirrored goggles, just untouched snow stretching between the trees. I stared in disbelief. He had been standing there only seconds earlier. There hadn't been enough time for anyone to walk away, not without leaving a trail, not without making a sound. Yet somehow, he had vanished. The words of the rescue worker echoed in my head. There isn't anyone there. I stared at the spot where the stranger had been standing only moments earlier. He couldn't have disappeared. Not that quickly. There was nowhere to hide. The trees were too thin, the snow was too deep, and if he'd walked away, the fresh powder would have revealed exactly where he'd gone. Instead, there was nothing. Just an untouched blanket of snow stretching through the forest. I blinked several times, trying to convince myself I was simply exhausted. Maybe the avalanche had left me disoriented. Maybe I'd looked away longer than I realized. Maybe the stranger had taken another path I couldn't see. None of those explanations felt convincing. The rescuers guided me toward one of their snowmobiles while asking the usual questions. Can you tell us your name? What happened? How long were you buried? I answered as best I could. Then I pointed back toward the slope. A skier found me. He dug me out. He walked me all the way here. The two rescuers exchanged a confused look. We haven't seen anyone else all day, one of them said. You are the only skier we found. I frowned. That is impossible. If he hadn't found me. I looked down at the snow beneath my boots. I'd still be buried. Neither of them argued. One simply nodded. Let's get you somewhere warm. At the hospital, doctors confirmed that I'd been incredibly fortunate. My shoulder was badly dislocated. I'd suffered several bruised ribs, a mild concussion, and early signs of hypothermia. Considering the size of the avalanche, they told me I was lucky to be alive. I agreed, because I knew I shouldn't have survived. The next day after I'd been discharged, I returned to the search and rescue headquarters to thank the man who had saved my life. I assumed he was probably another experienced backcountry skier who had reported the avalanche after helping me. When I described him, the rescue coordinator listened carefully. Blue jacket, he repeated. Older equipment, mirrored goggles. I nodded. That is him. The coordinator became unusually quiet. Then he asked, did he tell you his name, number? He said names didn't matter. The man leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Finally, he opened a filing cabinet and removed an old newspaper clipping sealed inside a plastic sleeve. He slid it across the desk. Take a look. The headline immediately caught my attention. Experienced backcountry skier missing after avalanche. The article was only a few paragraphs long. Several weeks earlier, an experienced skier had disappeared after triggering an avalanche in the very same mountain range where my accident had happened. Despite an extensive search, his body had never been recovered. Then I looked at the photograph. My blood ran cold. The man smiling in that newspaper was the same man who had pulled me from the snow. The same faded blue jacket, the same calm expression, the same face. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. That is him, I whispered. That is the man who saved me. The coordinator slowly shook his head. He couldn't have. He disappeared weeks before your accident. I stared at the photograph again. Every detail matched. There was no doubt in my mind. It was him. I spent months trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe I'd met someone who looked almost identical. Maybe stress and trauma had altered my memory. Maybe I'd unconsciously connected the newspaper photograph to the stranger after the fact. Those explanations sound reasonable until I remember the conversation we had. The route he chose. The way he knew exactly where I was buried, and the way he quietly said, "My job is done," before disappearing without a trace. I've returned to those mountains many times since then. Not because I am chasing another mystery, but because I still love skiing. Every winter, I pass the same ridge where the avalanche happened. Sometimes I stop for a few minutes and look across the valley. The mountains are always silent, peaceful, unchanged. I never saw the stranger again, but I never forgot him either. Whether he was an extraordinarily skilled skier who somehow vanished before anyone else arrived, or whether for one impossible afternoon, I was guided to safety by someone whose final act was helping another person survive the mountain that had claimed his own life, I'll never know. What I do know is this: if he hadn't appeared that day, I wouldn't be here to tell this story.